Welcome to the Disruptance Podcast. The Disruptance Podcast is the show that disrupts the way entrepreneurs think to make them more profitable and impactful. Rethink tired and outdated business norms to welcome innovation and unlock your unlimited possibilities. Here are your hosts, Eric Forney and Greg Fowler.
Eric, another incredible episode lined up for the audience today of Disruptance. Hopefully it's not on repeat because it is Groundhog Day, if it were. And I think that's the title of today's episode,
Right.
Kind of setting routines and building that perfect life every day if you were to relive it again and again. I don't know, like the Bill Murray film, if that's what we're talking about in a negative. But
I hope so. So.
But where do you want to start with this, Eric? I mean, everybody talks about routines and consistency and, you know, what that looks like to really build a life by design.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go down that road. I think it's pertinent, especially for today actually being Groundhog's Day or Groundhog Day.
Yeah, I mean, I just learned that there's only one groundhog for singular Groundhog Day. So I assume we only celebrate Puxatawny Phil today. No other groundhogs are able to be championed on this day today. So, it's interesting, Greg. I actually think life is probably a lot like Groundhog Day in that every day, for the most part, you just replay the majority of the day before. And very little actually probably changes fundamentally day by day, and that's likely a good thing. If you think about it, for the most part, humans are probably about the only thing that has any real variation to their day in general. Most other living things on this earth, they just keep going through the same Groundhog Day pattern day after day. Same thing yesterday, same thing tomorrow. I mean, hell, Greg, your dog just eats the same damn dog food on a daily basis. Let's be honest. It's Groundhog Day for your dog every day.
It's true. I mean, every once in a while, there's scraps involved. There's some bacon, stuff hits the floor. There's some excitement every once in a while. But yeah, I hear you.
It's belly rubs and the same dry dog food every day. And so it's so I was thinking that a lot of life ends up being the same way, which is that most of the results that we have are based on what I think are a few fundamental truths. One of those fundamental truths are the habits that we keep. And so the habits that we keep end up shaping the way that our life looks predominantly. Of course, there are edge cases to that, but mostly the behaviors that we take consistently end up causing life to shape a certain way. And that's probably the most understood and yet probably underemphasized point of life is that our habits end up actually creating our life.
But Eric, as you mentioned that into detail, there's a ton of reality in that situation. I mean, if you play the tape back into your mind, every day does kind of bleed into the next, and there's lots of consistency and similarities into it. But I guess where I want to push back for the audience and get some directives or some advice, if you're knowing that you're doing similarities every single day, are you getting where you want to go? Are you living the way you want to live? Are you satisfied with what's happening in the day-to-day? If you are, great. If you're not, I feel that most people, there can room for improvement. What have you seen, Eric? I mean, really being a consistent basis for life, for business, for relationships, for health, just wellness. Like, what does that look like? What does the groundhog perfect painted picture day look like for Eric Forney? I guess I want to go there.
Yeah. Here's the interesting thing is that, I'm sure we've talked about this before, but we end up looking at other people's life and we go, hey, I want that. And what we want really is like a slice of what we see publicly. We want just a portion of it that we are like envious or jealous of, or even that's a positive role model that we want to aspire to. Mm-hmm. And yet what we don't see is that iceberg analogy of everything that's underneath or everything that shapes whatever we see on the surface behind the scenes. Mm-hmm. And, I just to contextualize this the best parent that I ever was, Greg, the time that I was the very best parent, probably better a parent than I'll ever be, was before I had a child.
Wow.
Overwhelmingly, I was a hell of a parent before I ever had kids. I could tell you exactly how to parent your kids if you need me to, Greg. If you
Gosh,
needed
Eric, man.
me to tell you what you were doing wrong, I could happily do that for you. I'm confident I had the answers, and the reality is that doing it and then thinking that you know by watching from the sidelines and actually doing the job are very different. Apparently, the NFL works the same way. I'm a hell of a backyard football quarterback, but I'm not likely Tom Brady. But it doesn't stop me from yelling the same at the TV. And so
That's
I
awesome.
say all of that because you ask what's the perfect routine, and what I would tell you is that it's been an evolution, and I'm not sure that there is such a thing today at this point of perfect routine, because one of the most challenging things to do, the easiest way to be an entrepreneur is to be a single entrepreneur, have no kids, no wife, and the least amount of responsibilities possible. Because then the only thing you're responsible to is yourself and to whatever your passion and focus is. It gets incrementally more difficult when you add responsibility. It also means that your routines change drastically. I remember Gary, and I just realized I basically like cite the book of Gary Keller on a regular basis and on these podcasts, but I just so happened to have spent a decent amount of time learning from the guy. And one of the things I think is always interesting is that, he's made this comment that I could have grown Keller Williams faster if I was willing to not be focused on my wife and on my son. And his whole point was like, I was willing to work during these amount of hours, or I was willing to give up this percentage of my life towards this focus of growing Keller Williams. And anything more than that, I was unwilling to give that up because I was focused on wife and son. And so as I get into this long meandering story of best routine, what I want to first do is give permission to someone to understand is that there is no one routine that is best for any person.
Well said.
Because the challenges and the nuance that we all have based on our situation dictates a lot of times what's capable. It's taken me 40 years to learn that. Okay. It's taken me a minute to come to that degree of acceptance because I didn't understand how people weren't able to have the same routine and the same level of focus and discipline until I had to learn that by going through it. And so, at a certain point in time, I was up every day at 4:41 and in a suit and ready to punch life in the face on an ongoing basis. We're doing roughly the same routine ongoing, and it is very different than that today. Let's put it that way. If I'm up at 4:41, it's because somehow I've woken up and rolled over on a squishmallow or some sort of like troll or a elf on the shelf, and that I'm uncomfortable, and now I'm awake at 4:41.
Eric, the fact that you had really shown the evolution of life and that there is not a one size fits all routine, I think you're sourcing that life of the Mark Wahlberg and or Dwayne the Rock Johnson 4 a.m. club, gym, sort of lifestyle. And you're right, though. I mean, as we've all evolved into our lives and relationships and responsibilities, I mean, if you've gone down that road from being single to having a significant other to having a family, children, other responsibilities, and then maybe taking care of your parents at some point, life evolves, time adjusts. And I would love to get your thoughts on this, Eric. This is how I felt through different portions of routine and daily experiences. When it was just myself versus when it was just myself and my wife versus when it was myself, my wife, one kid and or two kids now. Yep. I feel that the time has done this because of focus on the things and other things that matter to me, not just what I was doing prior to. But what I found is I thought it was going to be very taxing. But for me, I was able to, what I was taking for granted, excess time, and I was able to compound my activity into action taking versus time wasting is what I felt, because I had an exponential amount earlier on. I felt that I got more done in less time.
Yeah.
And I was actually able to balance certain things out. I don't know if you felt that experience, if you were kind of forced to say, well, shoot, I had 8 hours, now I have 4, but I still have expectations on what I'm going to get done. What are your thoughts on that, if it's even possible or realistic?
There are times in which I see that, and then there are times in which I do not experience that at all. And partially because a large component of what I do ends up being thinking work.
Gotcha.
And or like creativity work.
Mm-hmm.
And they call it writer's block for a reason. And the amount of time that you have does not dictate what you get from written content.
Uh-huh.
Whether you get 30 minutes or 30 hours, you may still get dog crap. You could get brilliance in 30 minutes that might next week take you 30 hours. And so a lot of it I find has to do with the type of work that I'm doing at that given time. Whereas like when so much of what I was doing prior to wife and kids was roughly within a span of knowledge that could be largely repeatable. 98% of it was the same general zone of competency.
Okay.
Today, very minimal is in the same general zone of competency. Therefore, some things take a little bit of time, and some still require the amount of time that's required in order to resolve them.
Wow.
And that's probably what makes it more difficult from a routine perspective, because I know that your role is this way, but today a lot of my day is spent wearing no pants, sitting like this on a Zoom. And
you got the memo too, Eric. I'm not wearing pants either. So
yeah, this is the No Pants podcast. We've officially been rebranded. So
patent pending, trademark.
That's right. Most of my day is spent in the basement, locked away on Zoom, or in the office, locked away on Zoom. But either way, the majority of it is in calls and on Zoom. I hardly see anyone in person anymore. I'm like, I'm probably at this point in time like a Disney character. I just get locked away in the tower, and I don't get to see people in public. I merely get food thrown into the den when I'm just hungry enough. So So the interesting thing though is the routine component of it has to change. So then, in order to build an effective routine, what I found is you must at least keep the most impactful few activities consistent.
Okay.
Or as consistent as possible. So it becomes, how do you do less, but do the most impactful items in the shortest amount of time necessary in order to get some boundary of success from it. For instance, if it came down to drawing a painting, and I've got 30 minutes, I'm one hell of an artist, as you might imagine. If you need stick figures and ugly elementary school art, I am your guy. And so if we had 30 minutes, I could at least do the fewest, most impactful items in that 30 minutes in order to get the boundary of competency to look like a drawing of a 6-year-old. I could handle that.
Sure.
And yet, if I'm auditing 50,000 line items of a company financials, no routine prepares you for that component. So I've actually found that the more difficult part of it becomes, as progressing as an entrepreneur, is that the hardest part is actually maintaining a routine.
Okay.
When much of it ends up becoming reactive.
And I think that a lot of people resonate with that, going through the life as a real estate professional entrepreneur, and you're basing it off of, you've got a whole planned outline of what your day, your week, your month, your year is going to look like, but life hits you in the face. I mean, things happen. So what's your advice into that, Eric? I mean, how do you tackle the day so that you are able to get done the most impactful items, but still be able to position when things come up? I mean, moving the needle in a positive way to really do it by design. What's your advice? What's your takes on any of that?
That you have to be willing to cancel meetings that you have, not show up for some of the some of the nice to haves or should have. So for instance, I'll go through and I'll color code my calendar, and every meeting on my calendar has a ranking to it. And that ranking is basically like must do. And the must do's are the ones that generate revenue. Okay. Or the must do's are when I have to be accountable to another person because of some sort of positional requirement. So if I've got I don't do this today, but like if I've got a listing appointment, that's a must do. I'm accountable to this person who's going to be waiting at their kitchen table for me to show up and walk through their dog pee, fill their house, right? I'm going through and I've got a commitment to that other person. And that's also a revenue-based activity. So I'm going to keep those on the calendar. Some meetings are revenue and some of them are might do's. And so I differentiate between my might do's, my must do's, and my should do's. And then maybe if I have spare time and I'm just looking to waste it by sitting on another meeting, I'll get on that one. And
does not happen very often with you, my friend.
It does not.
I know that for a fact.
It does not. So I color code them and just go, okay, what are the ones that I must be the person who's there. And truth be told, I don't get it right most days. Okay. Because there's a lot of meetings I'm in that I find that I don't need to necessarily be there. And yet a lot of them I get invited to. And one of the challenges can be in a growing organization is trying to differentiate between what's an emergency or what requires urgency and what requires better planning.
Yeah. So
that we can decide if it's worth the investment of the time for multiple people. That's probably the most difficult part.
You know, what you say there is it's really interesting, Eric, and it brings up a thought into my mind is kind of prioritization and, looking at it from the end user's perspective of what is important and what really needs to get done versus what would have been nice or, really maybe isn't at all. I had a conversation with my builder the other day, and it was really interesting to talk about it. And what he said to me was one of the worst things that a builder can feel or experience is when they get a call from a client and there's water in the basement.
Yeah, for sure.
They don't want water in the basement at all. But what he also told me is he said, Greg, most of the time when we get a conversation like that, if it happens, the basement's flooded.
Yep.
And they get there and it's the smallest puddle. And it's really in a corner. So I think that you also have to interpret as to what is the severity of the problem or issue, or what is the severity of the timeline to get things done. And I love the fact that you're looking at it from a revenue generating and monetary standpoint and put it in a hierarchy. I mean, we all have to ask ourselves this question, look at it. It's like, we're all busy. I can't stand it when people say, I'm busy. You have to prioritize. And I think ultimately you want to ask yourself this question. Stop saying that I was too busy. I apologize. Say it wasn't a priority. See how that makes you feel when you're talking to somebody. Hey, unfortunately, and this bleeds into the personal side. I want to flip that side of the coin too. Eric's talking very specific business and everybody's tuning in for that. But I would say from a revenue generating standpoint from a family, that would be revenue into the heart deposit. Right? The emotional deposits in the emotional bank account for your family, for your friends. I would say make prioritization, not just into business too, but also to those must do's for family. You'd like to be around all the time, but at the end of the day, where do you really need to be? Where would you like to be? And where it's like, okay, I've got things that I have to position. What are your thoughts on that, Eric? I mean, if we're painting the routine, and the perfect day, do you judge it the same way? Like from a personal standpoint?
Oh, for sure. The challenge, the interesting thing is that I mentioned before, I've outkicked my coverage, and thankfully my wife doesn't listen. So she hasn't figured that out yet, I think. But I'm fortunate that she understands and realizes that, before we met, the first, I was in love with what I do for a living before we met.
Yeah.
And I love her and Hudson both. I also was in love with what I do, and Hudson will often bring it up and maybe ask, Dad, why do you work? Why you always have to work? Or Dad, why do you work so much or whatever? And, I always follow it up with the question that always says to him is, why do you play so much? how come you love playing so much?
Ah.
And his follow-up to that is always, of course, because it's fun.
Mhm.
My response is always, well, then why do you think I love to work so much? Because it's fun. And so play to you looks different than play to me. I play at work.
Yeah.
And so creating the, my goal in saying that is that I think what's interesting is that it's almost depressing to think that some people go through their entire adult life and don't feel like they ever get to play as an adult at work. They spend 8-9 hours, whatever it is, on an ongoing basis without having any play. Yeah. And being miserable in a job that's, stuffs away in a cubicle or on Zoom. And at the end of the day, I work with my friends. Mm-hmm. So how could I not enjoy it? Where I'm solving problems, trying to fix puzzles and get through, the equivalent of entrepreneur breakout rooms with my friends. Of course it's play. Yeah. And so the challenge I have is actually creating boundaries and throttling back the play component of work in order to balance the family and friends component. Mm-hmm. And candidly, I never get it right. And, sure. And yet I've also gotten good at then narrowing down the people that I can invest time with. Mm-hmm. And whether that's good or bad, it's quasi irrelevant. It's just a choice that I've made. Sure. And so if you looked at my phone, there are probably family members and friends that I have not responded to over the course of multiple days or weeks or months. Not because it's personal, but because I'm probably got it while I was working or doing something else, mm-hmm. and needed to move on to whatever the next problem to solve was, and never got back to scrolling down the list of all the people to respond to. Mm-hmm. And I've gotten okay with just being okay with that.
But that's the idea behind building this life by design, Eric. And unlike the Bill Murray film Groundhog Day, where he had no control, that it was going to repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat, every single one of us, you and I and everybody who's tuning into this, every day has a choice. Every day has a choice to set the tone for their day, the activities that they're doing, and the direction that they're going. It's a choice. And why would you go through life, as you had mentioned, not being on the positive side and not being thrilled, or at least for the majority of the time that you're doing whatever you're doing, to say, man, I really love that. And your response to your son, I'm going to use to Olivia, by the way, because she says the same stuff to me. Yeah. Literally, she does parodies of me behind computers and on phone calls. And I'm going to use that verbatim. It's just so amazing to kind of see that everybody's different and there's not one size fits all. I think when you're looking at a lot of individuals, and you talked about snippets of life or successes, I mean, comparison is one of the biggest robbers of joy as they're thrown around. So just don't. I mean, look, take advice from people who have been to places that you may or may not want to go, and think about what you're doing every day and your activities and your actions. But something else that really stood out to me, Eric, which is fascinating, even if you painted the picture by the hour of every activity that you do to that perfect routine for you, and somebody says, man, I want to be like Eric someday. Careful what you wish for, because when people actually step into those shoes, boy, oh boy, it's a scary thing. I mean, people like to see the success and the flash and the top peak of the mountain, but they don't know what it took and what that consistency was. And I think that people burn out trying to pile too much up. So what are your thoughts on that, Eric? Like comparison or building your own design, and kind of, finishing the thought on this episode of Groundhog Day, if you will.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a couple of things. You look at it and you go, if you're looking at, say, a CEO or someone who runs a large business, you have to think of it like a muscle. As in, they didn't wake up and have they weren't born with giant 6-pack abs and muscles. They develop it progressively, little by little, over time. And take in responsibility, and business is often the exact same way. Is that people get to where they incrementally grow the ability to tolerate or to be able to process more information information, make better decisions, and up to, I think it was Evan Spiegel of Snapchat. There were no 30-year-old Fortune 500 CEOs or no 30-year-old billionaires. And then Sam Bankman-Fried came along and frauded his way into being a under 30 billionaire, but he stole the money. Despite the fact that he was wildly intelligent, he was still incapable of running a business the way that it appeared on the outside. And so I think it's really important for a lot of people to look at it and realize that sometimes it's what they look up to is not what is reality. And especially if you compare your younger self to someone's what's amounted to be career, then you're only going to feel like you've got a long way to go, because the reality is you still have so much more ability to grow into that capability. And realizing then is that no one woke up incredibly successful. It was a slow iteration and what seemed like overnight success. Ricky Martin didn't just come out with his greatest hit singular, and so that was a long arcing career to put out one song that anyone knew. And most businesses work the exact same way. Most success stories are the exact same way. Frank Sinatra, I believe, has like 4,000 songs, and you probably can't name 5. But you can name New York, New York.
Sure.
And that's about it.
Come Fly With Me.
Oh, there we go. Okay. And so he put out 4,000 plus to get a couple that between the two of us we can name. And so you build to that success. I think of it, then it always goes, what are the most critical drivers of output? And from a leadership standpoint, there's a few of those. One thing that I always make time for is education. And then my second thing I always make time for is teaching. It's my belief that it's my job to teach people in the organization how to think in an effort to try to multiply myself, or in an effort to try to multiply their capability. They don't have to think like I do. It's just that my goal is to try to stretch the way that they think in order to act in a way that might align with their objectives. And then my goal is to aggregate information. So every day I'm going to try to always do those 3 things: teach somebody, teach someone, or multiple people at one time, ideally, gather information from the organization, and then also learn something myself. Because at that point in time, what I'm really doing is I'm creating the ability to get slightly better at influencing and building people by obtaining information from the organization, by then teaching the organization, and then by learning myself. I'm able to multiply the knowledge work. And so figuring out where am I going to keep those in my calendar every day? Those typically stay as a priority ongoing. But that's not exactly the same. If I'm a solopreneur, I don't necessarily need to think as much about the teaching part. I probably need to aggregate information from my industry or from various industries. So I'm going to need to learn something. But I'm then going to be responsible for all of the revenue activities. So I'm going to prioritize learning and revenue. And that's going to be the requirement as an entrepreneur until I'm able to delegate some of either some of the revenue or some of the teaching.
As you mentioned that, Eric, it's interesting, and I know you throw this phrase quite a bit. It's not very sexy what you just described there.
No.
But it's the slow and steady consistencies that win the race, the tortoise and the hare mentality. And to bring it full circle to Groundhog Day and even the film with Bill Murray, every single day that he was on repeat, he was learning. And he was getting better and faster with conversations, and what he was trying to accomplish was this initiative. And by the end of that film, spoiler alert, he figured it out and actually got out. But the idea is we can do this every day, and we can get better, faster, stronger, smarter every day. We have the ability to do exactly what Eric had mentioned, is to learn, to teach, to really aggregate and share. And improve the life by design, which I mentioned. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention one big piece of education that Eric always drops, not to mention disruptance here, but Market Mondays.
Yeah.
And again, Eric, I have to harp on it because the information is top notch. It's really compelling. And I always enjoy it. I just going through and hanging out with you and the group of people, it just grows and grows and grows. There's so many producers, and it's just incredible information, really crafting and understanding the market and the industry as a real estate professional entrepreneur. So I absolutely love it. We'll definitely have links in the show notes.
Well, Greg, I mean, that's an interesting example of looking at routine, and some of the challenges of routine is, so, if you're doing a weekly economics and market content every week, let me just tell you, the market doesn't change all that much from week to week.
Right.
And I realized that if the best content I put out is the subtleties and the micro changes in the market from one week to the next, that no one will show up and listen, and nor should they.
Nope.
So sometimes that show takes me an hour to prep, and sometimes it takes me 2 days.
Wow.
And it depends on the week. And it depends on what my creativity or how clear I am on exactly how I want to configure things. The goal, of course, of making it to where it's both, having to be edutainment. And so my Monday, for the most part, revolves around making that my singular priority.
Wow.
It doesn't mean that I don't have other things that I do before going on and doing an hour about the market, but it becomes the singular thing that I think about when I wake up, and then the singular thing for the most part that I think about until going live. And sometimes that job takes a couple hours, sometimes it takes a couple days. And that's the difficulty of keeping a routine, as you just keep these like pillars that you have to stick because they're non-negotiables, and then you fit everything around the non-negotiables that are either revenues, must-dos, should-dos, or should delete. And that's probably the most effective way to routine it.
You capped it, Eric. You nailed it, my friend, going all the way through and through. Another great one. And I can't stress that enough. It just kind of going down the line. And hopefully that was helpful for everybody who's tuning in. As always, we'd love, your feedback, any thoughts, any perspectives, maybe what your routine looks like, or any advice to the entrepreneurs of the Disruptance Nation. Just let us know. Drop a comment below. Eric, always a pleasure, my friend. We'll definitely catch you on the next one for sure.